I still remember the smell first. Scorched paper braided with cheap floral perfume. The apartment had its usual aquarium hush, glass holding back the weather, money holding back the noise. Outside, São Paulo sulked under a leaden sky. Inside, the air tasted like a promise breaking. My name is A.L. Monteiro, 36, and I live high enough to forget that streets have voices. Up here, the only noises are curated. The low domestic purr of refrigeration, the precise tick of a Swiss clock that has never loved a single second, and that day, the breathy roar of flame in a steel mouth. People think being rich means being free. I learned it means being watched. Cameras sleeping in the corners, motion sensors like little blind angels, staff who knew my habits the way priests know confessions. Even the elevator greeted me with the compliance of a valet. Freedom is loud and sloppy. Wealth is a librarian shushing you forever. I was raised among objects that cost more than apologies. If anything was broken, someone else was blamed. If anything hurt, someone else was paid. Halfway down the corridor toward the service area, I heard it. Not the soft disposal burn we used for spoiled food and shredded receipts, but a rushed, urgent blaze, like someone had decided to erase a past and found it wrote back. The service door was half closed, a slice of yellow light on the grey tile, a single ash floating through that light like a slow, grey moth. I pushed the door with my knuckles, and it swung with the meekness of a guilty thing. Lucia stood by the incinerator, a stack of manila envelopes clutched to her chest like hymnals. She was our longest-keeping maid, the quiet spine of the apartment, a woman who moved rooms back into place when people left them full of themselves. A strand of hair stuck to her forehead with sweat. She fed the fire again. 1 envelope, 2, 3, and in that churn of heat, I saw a name inked on the top one. Not a name, my name. The letters had the leaning angle of someone writing quickly, or someone trying not to be caught writing at all. Lucia, I said. Names can be small earthquakes. She flinched. The envelope trembled and fell crooked into the flame. The incinerator was industrial and indifferent. It ate my name like breakfast. We're close to reaching 1,000 subscribers. Help me share these stories of truth behind the golden walls. Where are you watching from? I want to know how far these stories travel. Her eyes found mine the way headlights find a deer, beautiful and doomed. So pai mandou, she said, voice tight as thread. To protect you. The accent landed softly on protect, as if she didn't fully believe in the idea, only in the order. Protection in my family wore the cologne of control. My father taught me the taxonomy of power, the way other fathers teach fishing knots or soccer formations. He believed the world was a ledger and people were entries, either appreciating assets or depreciating liability. Luxury, to say, is the art of making the obvious look inevitable. I was a son, but also a dividend, a hedge, an argument against the chaos he feared in the mirror. He called it love the way you might call a guard dog a pet. Show me, I told Lucia, pointing to the remaining envelope. I kept my voice low, like the incinerator had ears. There were 4 left unburned, each with my name stenciled in the same hurried tilt. Her hands hovered over them, then pulled away, as if the paper could bite. She shook her head. I can't. The words were small, but bricked like a wall. I didn't shout. I inherited my father's temper, but not his theatre. Silence gathered around us, a soft, ashamed thing. I could hear the city's far throb through the building's bones, like a distant heart, unsure it wanted to keep trying. If it's to protect me, I said, then I should know from what. She pressed her lips. Together. The incinerator hissed, a boxer between rounds. Then she did something I didn't expect. She reached for the top envelope, slid out a sheet, and handed it to me like a smuggled child. Quick, she whispered. The paper was thin, official, the kind that wants to be believed. Notarized stamp. A letterhead I recognized from my father's constellation of company, one of those shell stars that look like light but are really distance. The text was a neat block of English legalese that managed to say almost nothing while saying too much. I scanned. The words snagged. Trust amendments. Beneficiary discretion. Reputational risk. Then a line that caught and held like a hook. Contingent upon behavioral compliance as evaluated by the trustee. My behavior. My compliance. My life in a cage with velvet bars. I looked up. How many? Too many, she said. Old things, new things, things I don't understand, but all with your name. I thought of my father's office, the cedar and silence, the earth-toned ritual of dominance, the desk that could have been a yacht, the window that refused to let the city be larger than his reflection. He'd taken me there when I was 12 and told me the story of our family as if it were a fairy tale where wolves wore cufflinks. A dynasty, he called it, an inheritance of rooms where people waited for him to arrive before they admitted to wanting anything. He handed me a pen, expensive and heavy as a promise, and made me sign my first document. A formality, he said. I didn't read it. Children don't read the spells that bless them. Another ash flurried up, soft as snow and just as cold. I imagined the envelope falling into the fire a moment ago, imagined letters loosening, blackening into language's ghost. Paper is a second skin for the lies we want to keep warm. I flipped the page over. On the back, a quick note in handwriting I knew intimately because it had marked my Christmas cards with their annual audit of affection. My father's. L. Burn all sets. He cannot see these. A. He cannot see these. The sentence sat in my chest like a stone dropped in a well. Not should not must not, cannot, as if knowledge were a disease that would take me to a hospital with no exits. I remembered him telling me that the world was unsafe, full of men who would use my last name like a key. I didn't realize I'd need armor against my first name. Did he say why? I asked. Lucia shook her head. He said if anyone asks, I should say housekeeping. She almost smiled. Everything is housekeeping. I held the page up to the light, as if truth were a watermark. The incinerator's orange throat reflected on the glossy tile, making the room look like a chapel that had fallen in love with hell. In the small hot air, my thoughts grew thin and sharp. If he was burning documents with my name, it was because my name meant something he didn't want me to own. I thought of my mother's portrait in the hallway, the one my father insisted remain, though it seemed to watch the door more than us. She had left when I was 9, her absence stitched with rumors. A man who loved her with nothing but his time. An argument that broke like glass. A settlement written in a language money doesn't translate. My father called it betrayal, the way that a general calls winter a supply chain issue. Another envelope slid into the flames. The edge curled, black lace fading into absence. I felt a surge I don't often allow, a small, muscular anger that would have enjoyed breaking something delicate. Instead, I did what I was taught. I assessed whose signatures were on the pages I hadn't seen. What rooms had decided my compliance like a line item? How many stories of my life were archived in cabinets I'd been trained to walk past? The fire spoke in its simple, sacred way. Give, and I will make it nothing. Lucia wiped her palms on her apron, looked older than she had in the morning. People who serve rich families learn to age between rooms, to compress their years into the gaps between commands. He comes back tonight, she murmured, as if the clock were a person we'd offended. Then we have until tonight, I said, folding the page. Once, twice, then sliding it into the inside pocket of my jacket. The paper lay over my heartbeat, like a bandage pretending to be armor. I stared at the remaining envelope. Give me one, I said. Just one. The rest you do what you have to do. She hesitated so hard I could see it. Then she moved, quick, merciful, handed me the second envelope. It was lighter than I expected, like guilt on the first day before it puts on weight. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some doors you only open once. The incinerator took the third and fourth with the appetite of a god that doesn't believe in witnesses. The room cooled slightly, or maybe I learned to breathe again. Lucia closed the hatch and turned the dial to its low, perpetual ember. She whispered, I'm sorry, but I couldn't tell if she meant for me or for the paper. In rich houses, the truth often arrives dressed as an errand. Housekeeping, he had told her. The word echoed now, ridiculous and precise. My childhood had been a sequence of messes cleaned before I knew they'd ever existed. No wonder I mistook cleanliness for safety. No wonder I mistook silence for love. I left the service area with 2 new weights, the envelope in my hand, and the knowledge that something with my name had been turned into smoke. In the hallway, the portrait of my mother held her patient distant. The city outside the glass was a river of light pretending to be still. I paused, listening for anything that might confess. Only the clock making its careful little wounds. People think wealth is a guarantee. It is a rehearsal. You practice being the person your money says you are until the mirror claps politely. That day, in the heat of an appliance designed to keep homes clean, I felt the script slip. Protection, compliance, reputation, the holy trinity of our household, had announced itself in flame. My father had always promised to keep me safe. He just never said from what or whom. When the elevator finally sided me up to the living room, the apartment looked the same. Tasteful, tireless, curated to look inevitable, but every object felt different, as if it knew a secret about me and was waiting to see if I could guess it. I set the envelope on the marble table and watched the city blink. Rich people's apartments are full of reflections. That evening, mine held a fire I hadn't started, and a question I could no longer afford not to ask. Protection was my father's dialect. Control was the grammar. I grew up conjugating it without noticing. Morning routines were drills. Shoes polished to courtroom shine, shirt stiff with starch, hair subdued as a contract clause. The driver waited downstairs like a punctuation mark. Breakfast was a negotiation between proteins and time. If I was late, I wasn't scolded. I was briefed. Your future partners will read your respect for time in the first 30 seconds, he'd say, eyes never leaving the paper, as if newsprint were a mirror that loved him back. His world was an aquarium of expensive silence. Everything moved, nothing splashed. The office smelled of cedar and victory. The leather chairs had the kind of patience you buy. A brass clock presided on the credenza, wide-shouldered, smug, ticking like a lawyer's metronome. That clock was my first teacher. It didn't care if I was sad, only if I was on time. He collected watches the way some men collect alibis. Patek, Audemars, Vacheron, names whispered like saints. He'd lay them out on the felt tray as if exhibiting small, obedient planets. Each came with a story about discretion and leverage, who had noticed it at a negotiation, who had wanted it and given something up instead. When I turned 13, he gifted me a slim Jaeger with a dial so clean it looked like it had nothing to confess. "This doesn't tell time," he said, fastening it to my wrist with a tenderness he reserved for objects. "It tells people how serious you are about time." At 14, I got my first NDA. It wasn't called that, not to me. "House confidentiality," he said, sliding a crisp document across the kitchen island, pen heavy as small guilt. The terms were simple. Don't discuss the family, the business, the investments, the personal matters. Don't get photographed in compromised context. Don't date anyone who wants to date your last name. There was a clause about behavioral expectation, soft words with hard purposes. I signed because he was watching, and I had already learned that love, in our house, was the prize for performing the role without blinking. Our parties were staged like alibis, caterers drifting in black and white currents, ice sculptures sweating in well-tempered rooms, a pianist fingering standards no one truly heard. The guest list read like a small parliament, ministers of one thing or another, magnates who owned parts of the sky. The talk hovered above the tables, currencies, acreage, pipeline, the moral advantage of giving publicly versus privately. My father worked the room with the gravity of a planet. People orbited, warmed by his approval, chilled by its absence. At midnight, he would find me near a window, ask which deals I had noticed. It wasn't a question, it was a quiz. I learned to spot where champagne met strategy, where laughter closed over a hook. Affection in our house sounded like performance review. You held yourself well. That joke landed. Don't let your face show when you calculate. Praise was given in the currency of competence. My mother used to translate when she was still there. She'd smooth my hair with an absent hand and say, "He means he's proud." After she left, the translation stopped. The original language remained. I became fluent. Boarding school was a snow globe of the same weather. Sons of men who borrowed across continents. Daughters of women who wore charity like armor. We learned Latin phrases for modern weapons. Caveat emptor, force majeure, quid pro quo. We practiced debate like fencing, lunging, parrying, never bleeding where anyone could see. On Sundays, the chapel smelled of lemon oil and used ambition. I wrote letters to my father that read like press releases. He sent back notes that read like marginalia on a prospectus. Good instincts. Watch the tone. Never apologize. First, Lucia threaded through these scenes like a quiet continuity. She ironed the shirts that held me in. She left small bowls of cut mango near my textbooks, a kindness so gentle it felt like contraband. When I was 16 and I came home with a split lip, earned in a fight, I started just to feel. The rules bend. She pressed a cold spoon against it and said nothing. She never asked questions that would force me to lie. The first time I understood what behavioral compliance could cost me, I was 21. There was a woman, let's call her Marina, because she loved the sea and I loved the way. She didn't care that I couldn't swim. She came from a family that read books for pleasure, from a kitchen that smelled like garlic and laughter. My father met her once and smiled at her the way a banker smiles at weather. 2 weeks later, the trustee asked for coffee. He had a binder and a tone that carried condolence like camouflage. The trust would mature in stages. Certain life choices would optimize outcomes. Marina, it turned out, was a reputational variable. The numbers were breathtaking in their calm, percentages that could lift a city or drown a dream. I told myself I didn't care. Love is louder than math, until math owns the house you live in. I left Marina with a lie and a bouquet. I told myself it was to protect her. In truth, I was protecting the version of myself my father had prepaid. There were other training, media coaching at 23, how to answer questions without making news, charity selection at 24, which causes aligned with our values portfolio. Even grief had a syllabus when my grandfather died. Eulogy notes arrived with headings: legacy, vision, continuity. I read them at the podium in a voice I'd learned from watching. My father talked to rooms that could ruin him. People cried in the exact places the notes predicted. Afterward, my father squeezed my shoulder and said, "You carried us." It was, in our house, a love letter. What he never taught me was how to tell the truth when it was inconvenient to the brand of our family. He rarely said brand, that was too vulgar, but he honored the idea like a religion. Our crest was not drawn, it was implied. When scandals threatened, he didn't panic, he planned. If he was guilty, he made himself necessary. If he was innocent, he made himself indispensable. Necessity and indispensability look identical from a distance, which brings me back to the envelopes with my name, burning their way into a cleaner version of our history. In the hours after I found Lucia by the incinerator, I wandered the apartment like a man who had misplaced his shadow. I opened the envelope. She let me keep and found fragments that fit too neatly. Emails about adjusting distributions, memos about narrative risk tied to personal entanglements, a draft of a letter I was never meant to read in which my father wrote to the trustee, "He's not ready to hold power without mistaking it for love." The draft was dated 3 years earlier, around the time I left Marina on the pier with her patience and my apology. "He confuses freedom with self-harm," he had written. "He confuses affection with volatility." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps a father's clarity fit cruelty to a son who wants to be messy. But then the last line, protect the assets from his impulses, protect him from himself. It sounded noble and landed like a verdict. Assets, impulses, himself. I was a man classified as his own risk factor. I thought of a night when I was 9. My mother and I sat on the kitchen floor, eating ice cream from the carton, while the house exhaled the day. My father came home late, eyes bright with a victory he wouldn't name. He kissed my head and my mother's cheek and lifted the spoon from her hand. "You can have anything," he told me. "Just don't become a problem." The spoon clinked against the sink. I laughed because I thought he was being charming. My mother didn't. The objects of our life, watches, cars, paintings, were really shields. Each one said, "We are inevitable." Each one translated pain into position. When I think of my father now, I see 2 gestures. The way he adjusted his cuff at the start of a meeting and the way he signed his name at the end. Everything between those gestures was choreography. He believed people were motivated by fear or shame, and he found a way to rent both. He called it leadership. I am not innocent in this story. I wore the suits, learned the steps, collected the praise. I tell you this, so you don't mistake my criticism for martyrdom. I benefited from the machine even as it filed me down into something aerodynamic and bland. I knew the concierge's name in every city where the lights outnumbered the stars. I knew how to tip someone into loyalty. I knew, worst of all, how to let myself be managed in exchange for never having to jump without a net. So when I stood over the marble table, reading the draft where my father requested the burning of papers that mapped my life like a pipeline, I didn't just feel betrayed. I felt seen in a way that shamed me. He had anticipated my rebellions, assigned them categories, built fences around the fields where I might try to run. He called it protection. The trustee called it prudence. Lucia called it housekeeping because that was the language given to her. I called it what it tasted like in my mouth, a promise that came with a leash. Later that evening, after the city dimmed to its jeweled insomnia, I moved through the rooms touching objects the way archaeologists touch bones, the watch, the cufflinks, the books I'd been told to have read. My reflection, in the glass, looked like a man mid-escape, which is to say, not escaping at all. The envelope lay open on the table, breathing its paper breath. Somewhere below, a siren practiced being urgent. Somewhere above, a plane drew a white line through a dark sky, proof that you can move fast and still be. followed. By the time the elevator delivered my father home, I had learned what the fire was trying to teach me. In our family, love and control had the same handwriting. One asked you to be safe, the other required you to be small. I couldn't yet tell which one had signed my name. My father arrived. The way weather arrives, noticed first by the windows. The building's sensors hummed, the elevator sighed. The door opened with that discreet hydraulic confidence I associated with power. He stepped in, wearing the city like a coat he'd outgrown, kissed the air near my cheek, and placed his phone face down on the console table. A little theater of trust. Lucia appeared, briefed him on dinner, vanished back into the quiet machinery of the house. The apartment settled around him, furniture remembering its angle. We spoke the way men in our family always spoke when something mattered, indirectly, with cutlery. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey and admired the bottle as if it had aged in order to meet him. Long day? He asked. The question was a courtesy mask. He wore it well. Memorable, I said. The envelope lay open on the marble, like a wound, trying not to bleed. He saw it. Of course. He always saw it. He took a slow sip and regarded the city, a doctor considering an X-ray. Lucia says you were in the service area, he said. The words were neutral, all the sharpness filed down. You know how I feel about staff being drawn into our dynamics. I thought of ash, ink turning, to weather. She was following orders, I said. Exactly, he replied, with that faint smile that made praise sound like custody. We each have our roles. He approached the table, flipped through the documents with the gentleness of a man petting a dog that sometimes bites. He paused at the draft. I'd read, skimming, perhaps reacquainting himself with an older version of his certainty. Context matters, he said finally. Those were contingency notes. The world is less forgiving than you imagine. My job is to ensure you get to be a person in it, not a headline. The moral arithmetic of that sentence impressed me with its speed. By burning my name, he shrugged, as if the accusation were a fly that would die of its own smallness. By burning redundancy, he corrected, paper that could be abused if it left the house. The structure remains. He tapped the side of his head and then, casually, my chest, here and here. I wanted to tell him that structures are exactly what choke when they mistake survival for virtue. I wanted to tell him that protection had been our family's most sophisticated fiction, that every time he saved me, he took another piece I might have used to build, myself. But men like my father are bilingual in denial and destiny. He would hear critique as noise. Besides, I was still learning to speak in a voice not shaped, line by line, by his edits. What am I being protected from? I asked. That I can't be told. From your talent for combusting. Opportunities, he said, and it was almost affectionate. From people who delight in watching rich suns drown in a spoon of water. From yourself, occasionally. He lifted his glass. We inherit our enemies along with our assets. The room seemed to tilt toward a precipice I couldn't see. I'm not an asset, I said, but the sentence sounded childish once it escaped my mouth, like a boy declaring he wasn't tired while yawning. He studied me the way sailors study the horizon. You are my son, he said, and that means your mistakes cost more. That is cruel, perhaps, but true. He set the glass down and placed a palm flat on the marble, claiming it. There's a story out there, he went on, about sons like you, soft, indulged, allergic to gravity. I have spent a lifetime paying for the opposite story. Do not collaborate with the one that ruins us. It wasn't a threat, it was a creed. He turned away, satisfied with the sermon, and asked what we should do for dinner. In our house, crises were filed under logistics as quickly as possible. Dinner civilizes panic. We ate silently, the clink of forks a metronome for thoughts neither of us admitted. Midway through, he told me an anecdote about a partner who had attempted a coup over a minor shareholder dispute. He underestimated my patience, my father said, and smiled a small, private smile that looked like a scar remembering. Power isn't force, it's duration. After he went to his study, I stood in the kitchen with the stupid desire to throw plates. I didn't. Breaking things is a luxury staff pays for. Instead, I walked to the service corridor, where the air still carried a ghost of heat. Lucia was there, wiping down the stainless steel with her careful, ritual circle. She looked up at me, and for a second, I saw the whole map of our arrangement. Me, full of history I didn't earn. Her, full of grace she wasn't paid for. He knows, I said. She nodded. Of course he did. He always knows, she said. Did he tell you to? I couldn't finish the question without making her complicit in something she already was. He Told me to keep the house clean, she said, and resumed her circle, turning flame into hygiene. That night, sleep wouldn't have me. I lay on the couch and watched the city do its insomnia. Cars like commas, helicopters like erasers. Somewhere past midnight, the study door clicked. My father crossed the living room and stood behind me, a moon that had decided to be a planet again. "You're awake," he said. "So are you." He chuckled, fatherly, which is to say condescending masquerading as comfort. "Tomorrow," he said, "let's go to the club. Swim, clear the head." The invitation had decades of history behind it. Afternoons where he had taught me to outlast instead of outswim, to win by refusing oxygen to fear. "You always think better after a few laps." "I think fine now," I said. He let the silence grow claws. "Don't dramatize," he said finally. "I'm not your enemy." The word enemy hung between us like a chandelier missing a few crystals. Still beautiful, now dangerous. He went to bed. I remained. The envelope stared at the ceiling and learned with me that houses can be impeccably quiet while still screaming. Morning arrived undecided. We drove to the club, where water was, curated into docility. The pool was private, a blue coin in a marble palm. My father swam the way he negotiated, efficient, relentless, unshowy. I watched from the edge, heart keeping a different meter. On the third lap, he stopped and leaned against the tile. "You're sulking," he said. "That will bore you before it bothers me." "I'm thinking," I said. "Then think about scale," he replied, flicking water from his fingers. "Small fires keep you warm. Big fires burn down houses. Yesterday was a small fire. Be grateful." Something in me tipped. "Grateful for what?" I asked. "For the parts of my life I'm allowed to be briefed on." "For stewardship," he said simply, and pushed off the wall, slicing back into the water, a knife pleased with itself. I left him there, cutting lanes through clarity. On the drive home, I realized how thoroughly he had replaced the word love with stewardship, as if affection were a treasury one safeguards with policies. Maybe that is love for some men, not warmth, but weather control. The fall didn't arrive like a plunge. It arrived like a spreadsheet error that grows legs. 2 days later, a journalist called, not the tabloid kind, the patient kind, the kind that knows which doors have back doors. She had questions about a holding company I didn't know I was on the board of. "Routine," my father said when I showed him the "We'll answer through counsel." Routine is what men like him call sparks on the curtain. By the weekend, the story had a shape, not scandal exactly, an arrangement of trusts and loans that, if you squinted, resembled genius. If you stared, resembled a hedge maze. My name appeared in the 10th paragraph, unassuming, like a waiter in an expensive restaurant who knows too much. The article praised my father's sophisticated risk management and questioned our family's opacity. The photo they used of me was an old one. I was smiling in a way that looks like hunger now. The phone rang with calls from people whose greetings are cheeks. Friends offered concern that sounded like rehearsal. The trustee sent what he called talking points. My father, unbothered, orchestrated responses with that calm that had persuaded empires to cooperate. "This will pass," he said. And maybe externally, he was right. The market didn't blink. The partners didn't flinch. But something inside me yielded. A hinge, maybe, unscrewed by quiet persistence. I went to see Marina. I told myself I wanted to apologize, to return the years I'd pocketed. In truth, I wanted to stand near the life where I'd been a person, not a position. Her apartment still smelled like garlic and laughter, but the laughter had learned to be careful. She opened the door, and she was almost the same, which is worse than entirely changed. We didn't touch. We spoke like diplomats trying to rescue a country already underwater. "I read the article," she said. "Of course you did. You once told me you hated being managed," she said. "And then you let yourself be." "I called it love," I said. She studied me with the gentleness you reserve for objects that break loudly. "We call many things love," she said. "It doesn't make them warmer." When I left, the corridor felt too long. I understood finally that my father had been right about thing. I do confuse freedom with self-harm, but he had equipped me only with walls, not with doors. Back home, the apartment received me with its curated hush. Lucia had placed fresh flowers in a glass cylinder. Their stems looked imprisoned in water. I stood before my mother's portrait and asked it for instructions. None came. The city outside blinked its steady indifference. That night, I didn't drink. I wanted to meet the silence sober. I sat at the table with the empty envelope and a pen I could choose not to use. The lesson arrived without style. Wealth had taught me endurance and tactics, but not how to belong to my own life. I had inherited a company of precautions. We built a fortress so well that we forgot to make a gate. Around 3 in the morning, I understood the shape of the fall. It wasn't a scandal or a lawsuit or a ruined deal. It was smaller and therefore more lethal. A son who could no longer translate his father's language without losing his own. The house, aware as animals are of weather, settled 1 floor deeper into quiet. I finally slept. In the morning, nothing had changed and everything had. The incinerator sat, obedient, awaiting orders. The portrait waited, patient, for someone to name what it had always been watching. My father read the paper and ate his eggs. "You see?" he said, not looking up. "It's already yesterday." I poured coffee, black and undecided. "Maybe that's the problem," I said. "Everything is always yesterday with us." He folded the paper carefully, as if it deserved dignity. "The future is a luxury," he said. "We pay for it by surviving the present." That line would have made sense to me once. It did not anymore. The fall had already happened. Inland, quiet, a structural failure rather than a spectacle. When men, like us, topple, it's rarely a headline. It's a posture you can't hold up any longer. I cleared the dishes. Lucia took them from my hands, and our fingers touched. A small, human bridge over a very expensive moat. "Bom dia," she said, soft as a prayer. "Bom dia," I echoed, and felt the truth land. Abundance had made us efficient at everything except tenderness. Control had stood in for care so long that care looked like negligence. Silence had been our shared language. We mistook it for peace because it wasn't loud. And in that hush, in that carefully insulated morning, I realized the simplest, hardest thing. I could not be protected into a life. I would have to choose one, and the choosing would sound, in this house, like betrayal. The morning after the article, the apartment behaved as if discipline could erase memory. Beds made with hospital corner morality, glass that didn't dare fog, the watch on my wrist humming its polite tyranny. My father left early to stabilize, which is what he called reminding people why he was necessary. The door gave him the same discreet applause it always did. Silence returned to do its excellent work. I went to the service corridor and stood in front of the incinerator. Its mouth was closed, sleepy, innocent, the way a locked gun is innocent. I turned the dial to open the hatch and stared into the black. Somewhere in that char was a version of me that had been archived for deletion. I didn't feel anger. Anger was a performance I longer believed I could sustain. What I felt was a clarity that didn't need volume. I could name the thing at last. We called it protection. It was control. We called it stewardship. It was ownership. We called it love when we were feeling generous about our own cowardice. I found Lucia wiping the counter with a rag that had lived 3 different lives. "If I ask you something, will you answer?" I said. She glanced up, measuring the question for traps. "If I can. How long have you been burning my name?" A pause. She didn't dramatize her discomfort. She honored it. "Not just yours," she said. "All of us. Housekeeper." Then, as if frightened by the audacity of the truth, she added, "Algumas vezes." I nodded. "Thank you." 2 words I should have used more often in a life that had paid others make gratitude obsolete. I took the elevator down. I wanted air that hadn't been curated. The lobby was a polished sermon. The doorman said, "Bom dia," like a password. Outside, the city tossed its music into the light. Vendors negotiating with the weather. Motorbikes arguing with time. I walked until the buildings thinned into neighborhoods that didn't pretend to be museums. On a corner, I bought coffee from a woman who laughed with her entire face. The paper cup warmed my hands the way a life warms a body when you stop outsourcing it. I didn't plan the next thing. Planning had been my inheritance. Instinct would have to be my rebellion. I went to a lawyer who didn't have metal, animals, on his desk. He read quietly while I talked too much. I brought the documents I had, the drafts, the notes, the one envelope that had survived Lucia's obedience. He didn't look impressed or scandalized. He asked me what I wanted, a question that in our family was usually answered by budget rather than sentence. "I want sunlight," I said, surprising us both. "And I want a door I can walk through that isn't a trap." He nodded, slow. "Sunlight is expensive," he said, "but not always in money." Then we worked. He explained the difference between cutting and cauterizing, between litigating and leaving. He drew diagrams of trusts like haunted family trees. He used the word severance, not as punishment, but as medicine. None of this is cinematic. There were no slammed doors, no righteous speeches in echoing halls. There were emails with attached PDFs and meetings where water tasted like glass. There were amendments, which are the legal version of admitting that you tried to make the future sit still. My father was informed, politely, precisely, that certain powers over my life would sunset. The trustee called me, surprised that I had become legible. "This isn't prudent," he warned, which sounded very much like, "This isn't obedient." My father did not shout. He invited me to lunch at the club where salads are assembled like arguments. He wore the grey suit that made him look like a decision, not a man. "You're choosing turbulence," he said, surgical as ever. "There is a way to have what you want and remain protected. There's a way to be protected," I said, "and never find out what I want." He studied me for a long time, as if trying to remember the blueprint. "Your mother would have applauded this," he said, the sentence shaped like an injury, intended for me to accept as a gift. "For once," I said. "I hope she does." He dabbed the corner of his mouth with a napkin, even though it was clean. "Very well," he said. "If you insist on being a smaller empire, at least be solvent." It should have been funny. It wasn't. That week I called Marina, not to retrieve what I had forfeited. Nostalgia is just vanity with better lighting. But to return the words I had borrowed from the family script. I told her she had been right. I'd mistaken management for love, because management is easier to measure. She listened the way good listeners do, as if hearing were heavy work. "I hope you learn the quiet kind of courage," she said, "the kind that doesn't need an audience." We said goodbye like citizens at a border, grateful for what stamps can't record. Back home, I began liberating small territories from the empire. I cooked an ugly dinner. It tasted like honesty. I took the watch off and left it on the piano, where time could look at itself. I asked Lucia to sit and drink coffee with me. She refused twice and then agreed, which is the choreography of dignity. We didn't talk about the envelopes. We talked about rent and back pain and her niece who wanted to be a nurse because she liked the idea of being useful. I realized usefulness had been the only love language I'd respected. No wonder I couldn't recognize tenderness without a task. On the third night of my small revolution, I went to my father's study while he was out, not to steal. He had already taken what could be taken, but to look. The cedar held its breath. The desk tolerated me. I opened the drawer where he kept the tray of watches and took none. I opened the lower cabinet and found, among files marched into order, a photo I had never seen. Me at 8, asleep on his chest on the old couch that smelled like triumph. His hand on my back, not possessive, not managerial, just there. He had kept it where no one could see it, not even himself most days, which is a different kind of burning. I left the photo where it was. A man's secrets are only evidence to someone else. To him, their insulation. The call with the trustee came at noon on a Wednesday. The papers had been countersigned. My name would no longer be the lever he pulled when my life embarrassed his math. The money would still be there. Money is stubborn. But the terms that turned me into a compliance project would not. The trustee sounded like a man watching a bridge he built be replaced by a smaller, uglier bridge that might actually lead somewhere. "You're exposed now," he said, a last kindness disguised as a warning. "Yes," I said, "finally. You expect catharsis here." I did, briefly, like someone expecting weather to be noble. Instead, there was an unremarkable, a snack, emails, a nap I didn't take. Freedom is less cinematic than captivity. It lacks props. It also has no audience. Only after sunset did something shift. I stood by the window and watched the city compose itself into constellations of effort. Somewhere a siren, somewhere laughter, somewhere two people deciding to be brave. I felt a quiet I hadn't felt since before I knew what my last name could purchase. Not emptiness, space. My father came home late. He walked past me, stopped, came back, and stood shoulder to shoulder with his reflection. "So," he said, and the word held 1,000 impossible negotiations. "You've made your move." "It's not chess," I said. "It's leaving the board." He nodded, almost proud, almost relieved, almost nothing. "You'll come back," he said, but not as a threat, more like a weather report he preferred. "Maybe, but not if the price is silent." He looked at me, then the way men look at the sea at night, sure of the danger, unsure of the depth. "I don't know how to love the way you want," he said. It was the truest sentence he had ever given me. "I know how to keep you alive. I'll try living," I said, and walked to the kitchen, where Lucia had left a bowl of mango, yellow like a small private sun. That is the lesson, if lesson is even the word. There is no redemption arc scored by strings. There is repetition, interrupted by choice. There is the long labor of replacing management with love, control with care, security with trust. There is the quiet courage of not incinerating what scares you, and there is the knowledge that empires, family ones, financial ones, internal ones, do not end in explosions. They become museums if you're not careful. I am trying, in my clumsy way, to keep moving before the velvet ropes arrive. Sometimes, late, I still hear paper rustle where there is no paper, flame breathe where there is no fire. I open the hatch and let the dark be dark. I sit with the portrait of my mother and practice, saying nothing without also practicing compliance. I text Marina a joke and delete it. I send Lucia home early. I listen to the city tell its endless, heroic, ordinary story. And in the glass, my reflection no longer looks like a beneficiary waiting for instructions. It looks like a man who knows that money can barricade you from storms and also from weather. I thought I'd inherited his empire. I was wrong. I inherited his loneliness. If this story made you think, subscribe, not for me, but for every son who grew up in silence.